Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone joining us from across the country and around the world. My name is Alyssa Bombardier-Shaw, and I'm the Outreach Manager here at Represent Women. A very warm welcome to our second annual Democracy Solutions Summit, which brings together experts and leaders in election administration, voting rights, and democracy reform who are working on solutions to build a 21st century democracy. Thank you all so much for being here today. The first day of the summit is going to be centered on fair access and ensuring ballot access for voters and candidates. We'll hear about the scalable and transformative solutions such as early voting, vote by mail, automatic voter registration, and mobile voting. The day will end with actionable takeaways so that you'll know exactly how to help advance these solutions in your communities. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our website after the event, and closed captions are available in your Zoom menu. To start us off today, we have the wonderful New Mexico Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, and U.S. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clarke, who will speak to the challenges we're facing as a nation in relation to fair access. And I'll have you take it away, Secretary Toulouse-Oliver.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody around the country. Maggie Toulouse-Oliver here from New Mexico, and I'm so excited to be with this amazing group for the second year in a row for such an important event, and just want to not only thank Represent Women, but thank all of you who are joining and engaging in this important conversation. I'm going to put my glasses back on because my notes are on my phone because, we can't have nice things and technical difficulties. But, just to kind of frame, we're talking about fair access to elections today. And to kind of frame, I think, where we are in this country. I mean, obviously, we're going through really challenging times with regard to making sure that voters have access to the ballot. And in terms of the challenges that we are experiencing, it has a lot to do with mis and disinformation, with politics, on the grand scale. But the reality is that ballot access is being eroded in many parts of the country. We've seen some new pushes in the last couple of years since the 2020 election, not that it wasn't happening before, but I think especially since 2020, to limit early voting days and hours, to make voting by mail more restrictive, to push back on reenfranchisement of the previously incarcerated, and much more. Misinformation, again, to bring up this term, which is something that those of us who work and live in the election world are dealing with literally on a daily basis, can also affect the ways people engage with our democracy. Because the lies surrounding voting and elections make people mistrust the system, and then they may be more likely not to engage at all, which is obviously the wrong direction we want to go. We want to be working to expand access to the ballot box, because the best form of our democracy is when we have as good, as robust, as great voter participation as we possibly can. So I know the summit is going to focus on the ways in which we can begin to move forward, to begin to try to expand access to the ballot box. And before I close today, there are going to be a lot of conversations about, what we can do, the specific methods that we can do to expand voting access, whether it be more early voting, mobile voting, tools to get folks registered to vote more easily, et cetera, et cetera. I will tell you, we're on the precipice here in my state, which I'm really excited about, of passing a comprehensive piece of voting rights legislation that is going to widely expand access to the ballot box. It's going to automatically register voters. It's going to protect the rights of our Native American brothers and sisters to cast their ballot and expand their access to voting by mail. It's going to create an opportunity for folks who always want to get their ballot in the mail to get their ballot in the mail. And I brag on my state a little bit, A, because it's exciting for me personally, but B, because I want to kind of start off this conversation today with a little bit of inspiration that even though we are seeing challenges across the country to voting rights and rollbacks in some places, that there are places where we are working, and I think in a very diligent and meaningful way, to expand access to the ballot box. And so with that, I want to thank you all again for being here today. Thank you, Represent Women. I love being a part of this amazing organization, and I thank all of you for being a part of it too. And please know The New Mexico Secretary of State's office is also your Secretary of State's office. No matter where you are in the country, please reach out and let me know if I can ever be of any help or wisdom, inspiration, or just for a shoulder to cry on. I think that's what we all need sometimes, and appreciate you all so much. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much, Secretary Toulouse Oliver. U.S. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clarke is not able to join us live, but she has shared her comments via video. So let's take a look.
Good morning. I am so excited to help kick off day one of this year's Democracy Solutions Summit. Thank you to Represent Women for the invitation to join today's session. Today's theme touches on a topic that is a priority for the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, and that's protecting voting rights. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once described the right to vote as the most powerful instrument ever devised by human beings for breaking down injustice. And sadly, it comes as no surprise that a tool so powerful and so sacred remains under attack at this moment in history. All across the country, we continue to see efforts by certain states and jurisdictions to implement discriminatory, burdensome, and unnecessary restrictions on access to the ballot. We also see jurisdictions that are adopting discriminatory redistricting plans that dilute the voting strength of Black voters, Latino voters, and other voters of color. You all know well that the Department of Justice's tools in this space sadly have been limited by decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court, such as Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. Notwithstanding these challenges, the Justice Department remains steadfast in its commitment to making sure that every eligible voter in our country can cast a vote, that all lawful votes are counted, and that every voter can cast a ballot free from discrimination and harassment. And to carry out this goal, we recently issued guidance for a category of citizens who are often overlooked: our community members who've been convicted of crimes, our returning citizens. We're providing state-specific information to citizens who have been convicted of crimes and are returning to their communities to help them retain or regain their right to vote, their voice. But that's not all. We've also issued a plain language voting Know Your Rights resource to help the public better understand the full protections that are available under federal law, as well as guidance documents that address things like the Voting Rights Act's application to redistricting, issues that are related to post-election audits of election results, and guidance on federal laws that govern voting by absentee ballot and voting in person. We've also filed multiple lawsuits across the country, 8 in total. And these lawsuits are about supporting voting rights litigation to protect voting rights for all Americans, especially for our nation's most vulnerable communities. And I want to give you a few examples. In Texas, we sued to stop Senate Bill 1, which impairs the right of Black and Latino voters to vote absentee by requiring rejection of mail ballots because of certain paperwork errors or small omissions that are just not material to establishing a voter's eligibility. We also sued Galveston County, Texas, challenging their recent redistricting plan for the county's governing body. This is a suit brought under the Voting Rights Act, and our complaint alleges that the county deliberately reconfigured the only long-standing minority opportunity to elect district so that they would eliminate Black and Hispanic voters' opportunity to elect a representative of their choice. In Arizona, we recently sued to stop HB 2492. This is a law which imposes numerous unlawful restrictions on voter registration, restrictions such as documentary proof of citizenship requirements for voting in presidential elections or by mail. In Louisiana, we sued under the Voting Rights Act to stop the city of West Monroe from using an at-large method to elect its board of aldermen. This system had prevented any Black candidate from ever being elected to the board in the past. We've also entered into consent decrees to resolve matters. One example arises out of Oneida County in New York. And that consent decree remedies violations of the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act, allegations that stemmed from the county's rejection of nearly 1,800 provisional ballots that were cast in an election without attempting to verify the voters' eligibility. Another consent decree was with the state of New Jersey to remedy their failure or the failure of disability transportation programs, including the New Jersey Transit Access Link and local community transportation programs that are required to make voter registration opportunities available. We've also filed briefs in voting rights cases in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, North Dakota, New York, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. We are firing on all cylinders. And the briefs in these cases touch on very critical issues related to voting rights enforcement, ranging from the Voting Rights Act's protections against restrictions on a voter's ability to receive assistance from the person of their choice, to whether voters have a right to bring suit in federal court to defend their rights under statutes like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But the hard truth is that we are fighting these battles without one of our most important tools, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I was just in Selma, Alabama, and I am reminded of the need to carry John Lewis's torch forward and continue to call upon Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act. This is more important now than ever. And while we wait, we will continue to fight. We stand firmly committed to rooting out and challenging voter suppression wherever it rears its ugly head. Through our enforcement work, we will keep fighting to make sure that everyone can vote and that all of those votes are counted and that the results of those votes are honored. In closing, I want you to know that the Justice Department continues to use all available tools in its arsenal to protect our sacred right to vote. We know that there is more to be done and will continue to prioritize this issue in the road ahead. For additional information about the resources and the cases that I discussed today, I encourage you to visit www.justice.gov/voting. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you for your leadership and your advocacy. I wish you success as you embark on this year's summit.
Thank you so much again to Secretary Toulouse, Oliver, and Assistant Attorney General Clarke for your valuable insights and perspectives. Now that we have an understanding of the challenges that we're facing, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, Secretaries Tahesha, Jocelyn, Benson, and former Acting Secretary Leigh Chapman will talk about early voting, vote by mail, and automatic voter registration as a few solutions to these challenges. While we transition, we have some trivia questions for you all. So if you head over to @RepresentWomen on Twitter, you can send your answers in over there. And we'll see you back here in 1 minute. Welcome back, everyone, and a warm welcome to voting expert secretaries Tahesha Way, Jocelyn Benson, and former acting secretary Leigh Chapman. Secretary Way is the Secretary of State of New Jersey and is also the president of the National Association for Secretaries of State. Secretary Benson is joining us from Michigan, and Leigh Chapman joins us from Pennsylvania, and she previously served as executive director of Deliver My Vote. I will pass the mic over to you, Secretary Way.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. I tell you, I have been waiting for months to have this conversation with these two powerful ladies. As you had noted, we have here Secretary of State from Michigan, Jocelyn Benson, and the former Secretary of State from Pennsylvania, my neighbor, Leigh Chapman. And I'm just going to put it out there right now. Once a secretary, always a secretary. So we are going to refer to you as the acting Secretary of State for these purposes, Leigh Chapman. How's everyone doing today?
Wonderful.
Good. Well, I know we only have 25 minutes, if I'm correct, and there is so much that we need to discuss in terms of voting and our current challenges to fair access. So let's just jump right in. Now, before I ask the two of you ladies this question, I'm just going to say, similar to moments ago, Secretary from New Mexico, Maggie Toulouse Oliver noted how she's proud that they're doing good things in terms of fair access to the ballot box in her state. I feel the same way too here in New Jersey. I'm fortunate that our governor and legislature and I share the view that everyone who is eligible to vote should have free, fair, and secure elections without any interference. But at the same time, we witness one challenge that we know we can improve upon, and that is the voter turnout and participation. I know here in Jersey, we have statewide elections every year. And of course, it seems as if during the federal races, there's more participation than our statewide, local, county, and just legislative races, school boards, fire district races. So the challenge we find is making certain that our New Jersey voters can participate. So with that being said, given that voter turnout nationally is only about 60% in presidential elections, and on average about 40% in midterm elections, what are some of the challenges to ballot access and voter turnout that you see in your respective states? I'll start with Secretary Benson.
Thank you, Secretary Way, or shall I say NAS President, Secretary Way. Grateful for you and your leadership in these challenging moments. You're really extraordinary. So I'm too also excited to be here with all of you today. And I see in many ways one of the greatest challenges is the same challenge that has been really part of our democracy since its inception, and it's the challenge of ensuring not just that every voice is heard and every vote is counted, which is a lot of our work as secretaries, but also really to ensure that people believe in their voice, that people believe in the power of their vote. We talk a lot about confidence people have in their democracy, and usually that's defined in response to a lot of the misinformation that has flown into communities all across our country in the last several years. But really at the heart of it is this attack on not on people's vote as much as it's on people's ability to believe that their vote matters. And so in my view, really, as we emerge into this current moment with an opportunity to have a stronger democracy than ever before, with higher turnout, greater participation, and more people engaged than ever before in our country's history in this upcoming election cycle, which is what I'm working towards. We also are embracing and encountering really the greatest challenge in meeting that goal and making our democracy one in which we have a healthy and informed and engaged and vibrant and participatory electorate. It's really making sure that people know just how powerful their vote is, and how to communicate that effectively through multiple ways at a time when there are so many influential voices and a lot of noise trying to cause people to lose faith in the power of them and their vote and their voice.
So true, Secretary Benson, what you're saying, because voting is about empowerment, and it is about having the confidence in a process. And that is a challenge which we all, face and will continue to face. But that is why it's good folk like yourself and Secretary Chapman, who I'm going to turn this over to, have been fighting, to ensure that there is the confidence and the integrity and our voters understanding their empowerment through their votes. Secretary Chapman?
Sure. Well, first off, I wanted to thank Represent Women for having me, and it's an honor to be on a panel with both Secretary Way and Secretary Benson. It's interesting when we talk about voter turnout, because almost in every election, we always hear, this is the highest turnout we've ever had. This is the highest turnout we've ever had. But it's a shame when turnout in presidentials is 60% and in midterms, it's 40%. I mean, if we were to take a test in class, that's failing, right? So there's still a lot more work that we need to do to make sure that we're moving towards that gold standard, closer to 100% participation in our elections process. And, yes, there are barriers to the ballot box that those of us on our call are really fighting to eliminate. And, we're working on expanding the electorate, but I really think it all starts with education and talking to voters about the importance of voting in an election, connecting it to their everyday lives, connecting the offices to their everyday lives. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, this year, the county commissioners across the 67 counties are being elected. Yes, the Secretary of State does have authority to oversee those 67 counties, but it's really the county commissioners that make the decisions as far as what polling places are open in people's neighborhoods, where drop boxes are located. So these off-year elections are really essential, and it's important that we're educating voters about what's at stake, not only in the midterms, not only in 2024 as we're looking ahead, but in the elections that are happening right now as we speak.
And to your point, Secretary Chapman, making sure that voters understand this important thing, which we just call democracy, right? And I know that, especially when I go to the schools and I talk to students about, when you get to be 18, please vote. And the one question that will always get tossed my way is, Secretary Way, why does ballot access matter to our democracy? So what are your thoughts about that?
Secretary Benson, you can go ahead.
Oh, I thought she was directing at you.
That's okay.
That's okay. I'm happy to take it. Thank you, Secretary.
Sure,
I'm happy to answer on behalf of Michigan and Pennsylvania. I think we both see there are data-driven ways in which we can increase access to the vote, and it does tie up in making sure those young voters as well know the path to participating and the importance of participating in every election. In Michigan, we're working to we have automatic voter registration. I'm not sure in Pennsylvania if that's in place yet, but I know in Michigan we automatically register people when they get their driver's license, and so what we're working to add to that to ensure access is because a lot of people get their driver's license when they're 16 or 17 and yet register to vote when they're 18, allowing for the pre-registration of citizens when they get their driver's license, so that at that young age, they are part of the system and then able to participate and get information about participating as soon as they become of age and voting. We also have great opportunities with our college campuses, and I know there's a lot of work that Secretary Chapman did as well in 2022 on college campuses in Pennsylvania to connect with young voters and to ensure that they know, especially if they are transient voters or have been are new to the community but want to vote in the community, how to get information, register to vote as well. We in Michigan have election day registration, and so we have polling places on campuses, drop boxes on campuses to again increase increase the number of access points and options citizens and young people have to register and vote. And what the data shows is, particularly for young voters, the importance of getting them the information in multiple ways, in multiple times, from multiple voices. From people who are from their community, from people who they look up to in their community, is also very important. And so we will be expanding our partnerships with both sports figures as well as media figures and college campus leaders and others to make sure that we're inundating citizens and young citizens with information about how to access their ability to register or be automatically registered and then participating on election day itself.
Secretary Chapman?
Sure. So in Pennsylvania, when I was acting as secretary, our theme was really to meet voters where they are. So we were coming up with ideas to, meet voters where they were, so they didn't have to go out and find the information. So what we did was, the Governor Wolf, former Governor Wolf, actually issued an executive order that expanded the voter registration agencies in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we added many different agencies that were not already on the list, like, for instance, parks or recreation centers, libraries, just to provide more opportunities for voters to be able to register to vote. We also engaged in a vast voter education effort through text message, through email. And right before the 2022 election, because of all the litigation, we actually had a change in the law. So there was a whole dispute around ballots that didn't have dates on them, which was very confusing for voters. So we ended up having PSAs to make sure that voters signed and dated their ballots. So we're just trying to be as creative as we can to meet voters where they are, because the more opportunities they have to engage with voting, the more likely they'll participate.
I always appreciated, Secretary Chapman, when you said that phrase on the panels which you and I have served on, meeting the voter where they are. And, the question I had posed about the importance of why having ballot access to democracy. You reflect, and as I tell students, and I tell just voters, all voters out there in New Jersey, it's important because voting is the foundation for our rights and our privileges, our abilities to partake in various careers. I know, and I've said this before, that a century ago, I would never have been here as a Secretary of State. I would have never been able to vote. And it's important to have these vehicles that you have noted, these innovations in ballot access. I know in New Jersey, we have the AVR, online voter registration, about 400 ballot drop boxes that are secure for our no excuse VBM. And, even having those who are serving on parole and probation to be able to vote without even having any fines or penalties is very much significant and important. So I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Secretary Benson, can you provide examples of how these solutions have increased ballot access and voter turnout in your state?
Yeah, there's a direct line between the policies that we've implemented over the last 4 years and the increase in participation and turnout among communities across our state. So in 2018 in Michigan, voters voted overwhelmingly to put in our state constitution no reason absentee voting, enabling any citizen to have the right to vote by mail, election day registration, the right to register up to and on election day. And then our job was to implement them in advance of the 2020 election. And what we saw almost immediately in the first election in May of 2019 was an increase in both young people and voters across the board from past local elections in that same time period participating. So we were able to see a direct impact, and there have been plenty of studies on this, both in Michigan and other states, that show that with policies that essentially remove barriers to voter registration and then give citizens options to vote, whether they vote early, whether they vote absentee or before from home, or whether they vote in person on election day, giving citizens options on how to vote, and then building a system that makes each of those options equally available, accessible, and secure, drives up turnout, because voting is more convenient and it's more accessible to every single citizen in the state. And in that way, citizens are closer to being able to see the real results of their empowerment. So in 2020, even amidst a global pandemic, we saw 5.5 million Michigan citizens cast ballots. That was 500,000 more than had ever voted in any election before. And then at that same election, we saw 3.3 million of those citizens vote absentee, and 30,000 new registered voters on election day itself. All of those folks participated in part because they had these additional options. And also because in Michigan, those options were voter driven. They were enacted by voters. And then I'll just close by saying in 2022, we saw the same playbook again in play, where we had the highest turnout for a midterm election with 4.5 million citizens voting, and then many of them voting overwhelmingly to expand in our state constitution even additional rights. We now have 9 days of early voting in Michigan, for example, permanent absentee voter lists to ensure people can, if they choose to, have ballots automatically sent to them in every election. I know that's something you've implemented as well as in New Jersey, Secretary Way. And so all of those things we see, and again, the data shows that voters on both sides of the aisle and up and down the age spectrum really take advantage and embrace those opportunities. And that's exactly why we have seen an uptick in participation in local, midterm, and presidential elections in our state.
Nice. Secretary Chapman?
Sure. So Pennsylvania is a little bit different than other states. There's still a lot more that needs to be done for the state to get to the gold standard of election administration. There's no early in-person voting in Pennsylvania. There's no automatic voter registration. But what has been the game changer for the Commonwealth in recent years is mail-in voting, which was really used for the first time during the 2020 election. So because of that, it's a newer culture in Pennsylvania, but there are third-party organizations that have done studies that show that just the request of, or just the act of requesting a mail-in voting increases turnout. And when you look at communities of color in particular, the numbers go up even higher. So it's really been a wonderful tool to not only increase access, but also to increase turnout in the Commonwealth. There's still improvements that could be made, like pre-canvassing, but that's more on the side of the election administrator's perspective that will allow them to have results faster. But since mail-in voting has been implemented since 2019, we've definitely seen overwhelming use of it, and it's definitely a safe and secure way for people to cast their ballot in the Commonwealth.
I agree with both of you in terms of the vote by mail. I go back to 2020 when we reshuffled the deck, if you will, on how we had to conduct our elections in New Jersey. And it was primarily vote by mail. And I don't know for certain, I haven't done the data, I'm not the statistician here or anything like that, I'm just the Secretary of State. But I know that our voter participation records were shattered. And it was heartwarming for us, New Jersey, when we learned that we led the nation in youth voter turnout participation. So, it was a good thing hearing feedback from voters who said not only did they appreciate voting by mail, but they also appreciated the secure ballot drop boxes because they didn't have so much confidence, and no disrespect to the USPS. And, then there were others who, just felt more confident in the ballot drop box in comparison to walking it or driving their return ballots to our Board of Elections. So, I think that overall, that truly helped. The other option, I know that we just started in person early voting, the general of 2021, and we're relatively increasing our numbers in terms of that access too. So all of these things are good for our democracy and making sure that it is healthy. Now, I think this might be the final question. Unfortunately, you two have been so great. And I wanted to say, Secretary Benson, I know you wrote your first book on Secretaries of State. Now we're going to put you in charge of writing the second book on all this great data on top of everything else you have to do, okay?
Yeah.
She's
in the works.
wonderful. I tell you, you both are so phenomenal in all you do in your advocacy work, Secretary Chapman. My final question to both of you are, what's your goal for ballot access and voter turnout in the 2024 presidential elections? I know the audience wants to know. Secretary.
Well, thank you, Secretary Way, and thank you, Secretary Chapman, for joining us today as well. I think we are very goal-driven in our state, and our goals have not changed over the last several years in terms of ensuring that we're continuing to hold transparent, secure, and accurate elections that will reflect the will of the voters in its greatest extent. And as we look ahead to 2024, we also recognize that in many ways the greatest threat to the security of our elections is misinformation that is really and is consistently trying to undermine the work that we do and undercut the ability of those who are elected to ultimately govern. So our goals in the coming for elections is to both preempt and counter the misinformation with truth, while also continuing to do the work of building a strong and vibrant and secure system of elections in Michigan, where voters have confidence that their voice will be heard and their vote will be counted. I'll also add, we have a new provision of 9 days of early voting, as I mentioned, that we're already meeting and working to implement for 2024, working across the aisle to build a nonpartisan pro-democracy plan that will ensure voters know how elections are carried out, that they're secure, that they can be confident that their vote will be counted fairly. We're also creating a truth tellers task force where members of the clergy and other faith leaders, as well as business leaders, sports leaders, and community leaders will be coming together to serve as messengers of truth throughout the next 18 to 20 months, preempting, again, what we know will be an increase and an uptick in efforts to confuse citizens about the sanctity of their vote and the security of our elections. So we're ready. I mean, we've been doing this now. This is my third election cycle in a contentious moment. And I have a lot of confidence in the team that we've built throughout the state with our 1,600 election officials who are all working closer and closer concert than ever before. So we're ready for 2024, but we also are clear-eyed in knowing the challenges are great and that there are forces in play that we will overcome that will and ensure that our elections are secure and accessible to all.
Nice. Ms. Secretary Chapman?
Yes, so I just got back
I
from
know you're in the different position now, but still you're still on the ground fighting for our democracy.
Definitely. And, you know, I just got back from Selma, Alabama on Sunday, and it was my fourth time there. But every time I'm always reminded about, you know, the history of voting rights, how people died to make sure that we have access to the right to vote. But at the same time, I was inspired, you know, that although we have a lot more work to do, that there's a coalition of people in the states around the country that are making sure that every eligible voter's voice is heard. I was on a panel actually that was led by the Transformative Justice Coalition, and there were some Gen Z, there were some students from colleges, one in Pennsylvania, actually from Lincoln University and HBCU in Pennsylvania was there. And I was reminded that in 2024, Gen Z and millennials will be one of the largest voting blocs. I mean, I'm an elder millennial, but I can still claim millennial. And it's something that's just inspirational to me. I just hope that people understand that power, that there's an emerging electorate, that young people really may have the ability to decide 2024. And there are organizations that were down there that I was speaking with, like League of Women Voters, Black Voters Matter Fund, National Organization of Women, who are working every day in coalition in the states to make sure that they're registering voters, to engage with election officials to advocate for voting access in their communities. So I hope in 2024 that we can exceed the 60% turnout, and that a large chunk of that comes from the Gen Z and millennial voting bloc.
That's wonderful. Well, we're out of time. We want to thank, of course, Represent Women for hosting this panel. And of course, Secretary Chapman, Secretary Benson, you two are so awe-inspiring. You rock, and I'm just proud to be on your team. Back to you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, all these amazing secretaries, for sharing your wisdom and expertise on how these powerful solutions can make our democracy more accessible. It's so incredible to hear directly from the people who are involved in this process. So thank you again so much for being here. We are going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we will be joined by Layla Zaidane, Danielle Allen, and State Representative Jillian Gilchrest for a discussion on ballot access for candidates. Feel free to take this time again to answer those trivia questions on Twitter, and we'll be back in just 1 minute. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our amazing speakers for our session on ballot access for candidates. I'm excited to introduce you all to our experts, Layla Zaidane, who is the president and CEO of the Millennial Action Project, Danielle Allen, former Massachusetts gubernatorial candidate and director of Harvard's Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, as well as the president of Partners in Democracy, and the Connecticut State Representative Jillian Gilchrest. Thank you all so much again for being here today, and I will hand the mic over to Layla to get us started.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Well, it is so wonderful to be here, and I just loved the note that Acting Secretary Leigh Chapman left us on, this note of hope for the millennial and Gen Z generation. My name is Layla Zaidane, and I run an organization called Millennial Action Project. And we mobilize the youngest members of the legislature to build bridges and work on policy solutions together so that political polarization is not an obstacle to solving big problems. So I just love that note on millennials. And what a treat we are in for today, our viewers are in for, because I'm here with two incredible leaders who know a thing or two about solving big problems. You both have personal academic expertise in what it takes to run for office, and where some of the systemic obstacles might be. So once again, we're here with Danielle Allen, who among very many other prestigious titles, was the co-chair of the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and State Rep Jillian Gilchrest, who likewise, among many other accomplishments and accolades, my favorite title is that you are a member of MAP's Connecticut chapter, the Connecticut Future Caucus. And today, the three of us are going to talk a little bit about reimagining ballot access processes for candidates, and how that might be a solution to some of our current challenges related to fair access. So just to kick us off, just an open question to set the stage for us, the landscape of where things stand around ballot access for candidates in 2023, just so the audience can understand the current situation. And Danielle, maybe I'll kick it over to you first to start us off.
Sure. Thank you so much, Layla. And thank you, Represent Women. It's exciting that this is the second annual gathering of this kind. I just love these conversations. They're very empowering. So ballot access, people often take that term and think it means the right of a voter to get their ballot, to cast their vote. Ballot access, though, also means the question of whether a candidate can get their name on the ballot. In the US, we have really sort of 3 different tiers of difficulty for getting your name on the ballot. There are some states where you can get your name on the ballot by collecting a small number of signatures, a few hundred signatures, or paying a relatively small fee on the order of $1,000, couple $1,000s. In other states, you have to collect many more signatures, or there's a sort of structure that is referred to sometimes as an either or structure. You can either collect signatures to get on the ballot, and now this is really for statewide office, or you can win a certain number of delegates at your state party's convention. And that either or method can put you on the ballot in Connecticut, for example, in New York, New Jersey, Maine, Utah, a range of states. And then you have the most restrictive or the hardest way to get your name on the ballot, which is what Massachusetts has, which is a both and model. You have to both collect signatures and win a certain percentage of delegates at the state convention. So in Massachusetts, if you're running for governor, for example, you both have to collect 10,000 signatures and win 15% of the delegates at the party convention. And then there's another wrinkle. Those delegates are not, it sounds like it's a proportional process, but actually you have to win delegates at 600 caucuses around the Commonwealth. And those caucuses operate for the most part in a winner-take-all way, like the Electoral College. So delegates are not given out proportionally in the caucus system, which means, if you have a single dominant candidate, they can really take all the delegates. And there's never room on the ballot at the end of the day for more than 3 candidates. And in some cases, there's not really room for more than 1 or 2 candidates on the ballot as a matter of mathematical necessity. So that's the most restrictive version of ballot access. That's what we have in Massachusetts.
Wow. Okay. Sounds super simple and easy. Rep Gilchrest, what does it look like from where you sit in Connecticut?
Thank you so much. And I too want to thank Represent Women. This is so great to be here and so good to see you, Layla. I'll build off what Danielle just said. So easy. So there are all these complicated rules. But what the current landscape looks like is, how do you find those rules? And how do you know what you need to achieve in order to get on the ballot? And so that information is oftentimes not very clear. You have to dig quite a bit and know who to ask and how to ask the questions in order to understand how you get access to the ballot. And so there remain quite a few barriers to getting that information. And then the other piece I'm interested in speaking about today is just kind of the mentality of, should you be the one seeking access to the ballot? And that still remains a big barrier, and people's beliefs on who should and how you should use the processes that are in place.
Wow. Such a good point. And maybe we'll sort of dig into that a little bit, because both of you have really studied this topic, you've taught this topic, you also have personal experience with it. So tell us, what was it like for you when you decided to throw your hat in the ring and actually access the ballot yourself as a candidate?
Well, I want to just say, I think how important this conversation is. For starters, when you're thinking about a healthy democracy, we do focus on voting itself as the cornerstone. It's important to remember that the right to vote is valuable as long as there's actually choice in terms of an election, a competitive election. So we need not just the right to vote, but also the right to run. And then I would say, even if you've got that and you've got competitive elections, it's also important that you be able to see what your elected office holders are doing. That is, we need healthy journalism. We need to be able to see how campaign finance is operating, sort of so you can follow the money. So in order to use competitive elections to hold people to account, there's a sort of right to see and shape your community through journalism or campaign finance sort of transparency. So a healthy democracy is about the right to vote, the right to run, and the right to see and shape your community. But you asked about my personal experience. So I want to really second what Rep Gilchrest said. So my experience is that I raised about $1.4 million running for governor in Massachusetts, spent about $1 million of that, worked for 15 months, and dropped out because I was not going to make the ballot. I was not going to win enough delegates in that both and process in the convention part of that in Massachusetts. Now, along the way to that, it was absolutely the case that, as Rep. Gilchrest said, the information was hard to come by. So when I describe that both and process, that is not actually written down anywhere. All righty. The actual complete process in all its dimensions is not written down in one place. The part about gathering signatures is in state laws. The part that is about getting 15% of the delegates is in the state party charter. Then the part that's
Oh, I think we may have lost Danielle for just a second.
I can jump in until she returns, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, let's pass the baton to you.
Okay. So I decided to run for state representative, and I decided to do so in a primary. So I'm a Democrat, and I decided to challenge a long-term incumbent. He had served for 23 years. And very similar to what Danielle is saying, the rules on how I would get ballot access were both in state law and in local Democratic town committee charter. And so trying to figure out, would I need 15% of the delegates, or would I need to petition, took me probably 4 different asks over the course of months. And so I would advise, you start planning ahead of time, because to get that information was challenging. When I finally was told to look at the Democratic Town Committee bylaws, the bylaws that were on the website actually said draft across them. So I was again presented with, are these the rules? Did you vote on these? Are these not the rules? At the end of the day, I did discover that I would need to petition on. But what that looks like is a very antiquated process where you need to get papers from your local registrar and then go door to door getting Democratic signatures from registered Democrats. And you have to get people's names, birth date, and address. And I'll tell you, going door to door, people are a bit sketched out that you are asking for that private information on a piece of paper going door to door. The other piece I was talking about earlier is just this mentality that, I kept being told, you can't do this. You can't do this to him. So there's still this sense that you shouldn't primary your own party. You shouldn't come for your own. And I would rely on the fact that, well, we have a process in place, and I'm using that process. So there's just, if folks are interested in doing this, and I hope they are, it's important to have like a team or a network around you where you can debrief and get the emotional support you need, because those who are part of your team, the Democrats in this case, weren't too pleased with what I decided to do. And again, giving yourself that time, because in order to get the information you need, people who know it might not be willing to share it.
Yeah. Wow. And Rep, just a follow-up question. Since you first ran in that primary, it speaks actually very beautifully to Danielle's point about choice and giving voters choice, right? Has that information become more accessible or available to other candidates, or is it still sort of kind of difficult to get a hold of?
What has happened, great question. What has happened at our local Democratic Town Committee is that the process of becoming the Democratic candidate has become more open. And when a seat is becoming available, we give more time to let people know. We invite in all folks who are interested in running. So that process has changed. I cannot speak for all the rest of the state and the committees across the state, but in our town, that certainly has changed.
Yeah, that's great. Danielle, we'll get you back in. You were sharing some of your personal experience as well. And I think you had just sort of finished talking about that pivot where you were also sort of similar to Rep. Gilchrest, really scraping for information to get on that ballot. So tell us more about sort of what that looked like from your perspective.
Well, I hope I shared that there's no single place in Massachusetts where the whole process is actually documented. One place where you can go to understand that. So I do think that there's a huge job. I honestly believe in Massachusetts, we should be simplifying the procedure. We should be reforming ballot access from the both and method to the either or method that our neighboring states all use. I think that would be really beneficial. But in addition, it just seems to me that there's really important obligation on the part of the Secretary of State's office to provide complete information. I run a civic education provider in the state for grade 8. We have a sort of year-long grade 8 curriculum. And there's a part of me, honestly, that feels as if we can't do our job as civic educators for young people because we can't actually refer them to public documents that can teach them the process for how to run for office in the state. Again, there are official documents up, but they're not complete. So I think we have a lot of work to do to clarify what a standard would be for full transparency around ballot access.
And this is great because now I hear the conversation kind of pivoting to, all right, we've identified some of the problems, both at a systemic level and certainly what you experienced personally. Where are some of the opportunities for things to change? What are some of the things that can be done to tackle this problem?
So I certainly think it'd be great to modernize the petition process, which in my mind then is making it electronic. And so having some type of secure place where folks who are registered to vote, I understand it needs to be, people who are part of your party, but where they can go on and sign the petition virtually rather than maybe needing to go door to door. Or if we're still not there yet, at least having some kind of electronic means to sign the petition. So when you go door to door, folks know that their information is being kept private and it's not just on this piece of paper that everyone else in their neighborhood can look at.
No, I think that's a really, really important part of it for sure. I also want to put a call out to all the lawyers out there, all the lawyers in the room. The legal profession has invested a huge amount of time and energy in laying out standards for healthy access to the vote, to the healthy access to the ballot box. And there's just very little by the way of actual legal scholarship on the question of what standards should be for that right to run and what candidate experience should be. But the truth is you can't have a healthy democracy without both of those parts. The state of Massachusetts Constitution has both a right to run and a right to be elected. So in that regard, we really actually need the legal profession to step up and help map out this space, document standards and document sort of variation across the country in this regard. I think we need that kind of mapping in order to have more clarity about solution sets.
Yeah. Well, final question for me is there anything exciting that you see happening already? Where have people gotten the ball rolling on this issue? Rep. Gilchrest?
Well, what I'd say a huge positive in Connecticut is that we have, if not the strongest, some of the strongest campaign finance laws in the country. And so something that was completely off the table for me running for office was money. So every candidate, if you accept public financing in the state of Connecticut for state reps, state senate, and our statewide offices, you have to raise a certain amount of money from a certain amount of constituents. And then you qualify for a grant. And so with the 23-year incumbent, he and I both had to do the same method to qualify, and then we got the exact same grant. And so there was none of that. Well, he was the co-chair of the education committee. And so there were many people who would not endorse me, but at least I didn't have to worry about him getting a ton of PAC money and money because that wasn't a part of it. So for those out there listening, if you could look at the Connecticut model in terms of our public financing, I think that is a huge positive for getting more diverse candidates running for office.
That's great.
I want to second that. Actually, I always hold up the Connecticut campaign finance model as a beautiful public finance model. It does improve candidate diversity immensely. That's documented. Connecticut also in the 90s switched from that both and ballot access procedure to the either or ballot access procedure. Utah switched a couple of years ago. So between Connecticut in the 90s and Utah most recently, basically the whole country has made that transition except for Massachusetts. So we have some work to do.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank you both for joining me today, and our viewers getting to hear this incredible conversation. We could have gone on for 3 times as long, but just join me in thanking Rep. Gilchrest, Danielle, Allen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you so much, Layla, Danielle, and Jillian, for this wonderful discussion. This is an area of democracy reform that I think, like Danielle said, people don't always know about, and I don't think that it gets discussed enough. So thank you again for bringing your knowledge on what can be done to address these challenges that candidates face and upgrade our system. The third and final session that's coming up next will be a panel discussion with a group of outstanding women who I will introduce after we take a quick break. There's still time to answer our trivia questions that we showed before, and we're also live tweeting, so feel free to go check out our Twitter for all of those. And we will see you again back here in just 1 minute. Welcome back. For our last session today, we'll tie in the discussions we've had on the solutions for fair access by learning exactly what steps we need to take from a panel of experts who are on the ground and out there making things happen. There will be time for an audience Q&A in this session, so I encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A feature in your Zoom dashboard. This panel discussion is going to be moderated by Keesha Gaskins-Nathan, the program director for the Democratic Practice United States at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We're going to hear from Sarah Blahovec, disability civic engagement expert and U.S. voting rights expert at the Carter Center. Yael Bromberg, chief counsel and strategic advisor for the Andrew Goodman Foundation and principal of Bromberg Law LLC. Jocelyn Bucaro, director at Mobile Voting. And Talisha Searcy, mayor of Tacoma Park, Maryland. Civil technology expert Michelle Mesa was originally going to be joining us, but she had something come up last minute, so she's unable to attend today. But I want to welcome you all and thank you all for taking the time to be here. With that, Keesha, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Represent Women for putting this on. Such an amazing opportunity to talk about these questions of structural democracy in the context of women's engagement. Also super excited to be on this panel. There are so many amazing women here today, and I'm excited to learn from each and every one of them. We're going to dive right into questions. And so what we're really speaking about after having these great 10,000 conversations is really thinking about what specifically are the action items. And I'm getting notice that my sound is coming in, so I'm not going to spend too much time more talking. And then Sarah, good morning, good afternoon. Tell us about the unique challenges faced by disabled people and what have yet to be addressed. And I think that's an incredibly broad question, given the scope and scale of disability. And so I welcome you to enter this and sort of helping us understand when we think about disability, people with disabilities, and we think about what it means to engage. How are you all shaping these questions? What are you thinking about? And how should we be thinking about removing barriers, even in the design solutions?
Yeah, happy to answer that question. I do want to give a quick disclaimer, as I know my role with the Carter Center was mentioned. I am not here representing them in any capacity. I'm just here as myself, so I just wanted to make that clear. But very happy to be here. And yeah, it is a very broad question. The disability community, 1 in 4 American adults have a disability. And that number is only growing with the COVID pandemic and the introduction of long COVID, where I believe an estimated 20 million or more people are experiencing long COVID, either temporarily or permanently. And the accessibility challenges to voting are rampant throughout the entire voting process, from registration to getting voter information to being able to cast your ballot. And so it is a very broad challenge, despite the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act is over 30 years old. And so whenever it comes to what we should be thinking about in terms of moving or trying to address those barriers, I like to break it into 2 buckets in terms of the attitudinal barriers and the prejudice that we have to address, and also the structural barriers to access. In terms of structural barriers, that is things like inaccessible voter registration processes, whether that is the websites are not completely accessible to people who use assistive technology. Same thing goes for election offices in terms of their information that is available. That could be the state or local election offices. Sample ballots are often not available in accessible formats. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of barriers to being able to cast your ballot. Whenever it comes to the polling place, studies by the GAO in 2016 found that only, I believe, 17% of polling places had were completely accessible. Sorry, only 17% were completely accessible of the ones that they studied. And so that can be the fact that, infrastructure, there are infrastructural challenges, whether it is, broken sidewalks or inaccessible buildings that are chosen for the polling places. That can be the issues inside the polling places with the way ballot marking devices or accessible equipment is set up, or the physical accessibility of the building inside. And then these challenges also extend to voting by mail. In 2020, we did see some improvements to voting for people with disabilities, because some did benefit from having access to vote by mail, but there is no one system that is completely accessible to all people, and voting by mail has significant challenges for people who are considered to be people who have print disabilities. So people who have difficulty with marking a ballot due to blindness or physical disability, difficulty reading a ballot due to learning disabilities. And we're lucky today to be joined by Jocelyn Bucaro, who's actually one of the experts on one of the solutions on this, which is mobile voting. And so that has been extended in a number of states where there is accessible absentee ballot processes. Sometimes it is for just being able to receive and mark your ballot, which is very important. And then sometimes it is for the entire voting process, where you're able to return that ballot as well, so that people can access a private and independent ballot. And that is really, privacy and independence is really what is important in the voting process for all voters, and especially people with disabilities. It should not be expected, and it is, against the law for people with disabilities to be denied a private and independent ballot. And that is what we have to continue working towards. So that includes doing things such as passing legislation to get more accessible vote by mail options in different states, upgrading infrastructure, working with election offices whenever it comes to site selection and survey of the possible polling places, as well as whenever it comes to making sure that their election information is accessible and their registration processes are accessible. So there are a number of things that disability advocates are doing at the local, state, and federal level. There has been, there's obviously very important federal legislation that has been passed for disability. And there have been attempts in recent years as well to try to upgrade the voting process so it's more accessible, such as the Accessible Voting Act, which Senator Casey introduced in 2020 and unfortunately did not pass the Senate. So I would say it's a mixture of that on the ground work by disability advocates and pushing for legislation is really important.
Right on. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm hoping the switch to mic has improved my audio. Wonderful. Yael, how are you today? Wanted to ask you a few questions about your expertise in youth voting. What solutions can increase youth voter participation, and what are some of the effective strategies? And I would love for you to think about the distinction, or talk a little about the distinction between our youth voters who are affiliated with post-secondary and secondary institution and those who are not, because we've got a whole bunch of youth out there that aren't necessarily in college or university. And so are there different strategies we should be thinking about?
Thank you, Keesha. And it's just such a privilege to be able to join you all in conversation for this panel. And thank you to Represent Women for facilitating these fantastic and inspiring women expert leaders across the country for today and the next 2 days. Thank you, Keesha, for the question. So I think I agree with Sarah that there's no one single strategy. We need to modernize our election systems across the board. Voters deserve a choice and how they vote. And the 2020 election really showed us what can happen when we move forward and modernize our election systems. Secretary of State Way earlier today talked about what took place in New Jersey, for example, during the 2020 race, when the single highest youth voter participation of the nation came from New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey originally, so I'm a little biased, but I was following it, and 67% of young people voted in New Jersey. 57%. This was the highest rate, 57. This was the highest rate in the nation. And when you look at the voting mechanisms that had been in place, automatic distribution of vote by mail ballots, right? This was something that we embraced as expansion and modernization of our election system in the midst of the pandemic. And we have a lot to learn from what those systems look like. My experience working with young people, I believe in a strategy that is not monofaceted. I think we need to approach this work in a very dynamic way. My background, I'm a constitutional rights attorney and a legal scholar of the 26th Amendment, which is the most recent voting rights amendment to be ratified into the Constitution 52 years ago, which outlaws discrimination with regard to ballot access on account of age. And what I found, based on my background in organizing and constitutional rights and scholarship, is that we need to have choice in how, and young people need choice. And the methodology for that choice should be a combination of organizing, applied research, advocacy, constitutional rights, and public education. Because if we don't know what the rights are, and if we don't know what the best practices are, then we can't, which should be coming from the field, the organizers can't funnel that, and we can't allow for really kind of an applied learning of those rights. I'll give you just a few concrete examples of that. So one that is a critical piece is expanding access for young people to vote from college campuses. I brought a case on behalf of Bard College, the university president, and the students in Blue Empire State, New York, where 70% of the students were availing themselves, 70% of the voting residents in the county came from the campus. Do you know who was a huge advocate for this measure? Was the disability rights organizations, because they said that polling place is ADA accessible. And not only do we, even if we're students and even if we're not students, we want to be able to avail ourselves of that mechanism. And through 3 years of litigation, separate cases that I brought, we motivated a change in state law in New York to now mandate on-campus polling locations on requisite colleges and universities across the state. This is going to be extraordinarily transformative. I surveyed the campuses that we have in the Andrew Goodman Foundation Vote Everywhere docket to track with the availability of this election mechanism with voter turnout, and it's on track for mechanisms like same-day registration in terms of youth voter engagement. And taking a step back also, and in Florida, we brought precedential litigation on the 26th Amendment to overturn a ban that the Secretary of State had imposed to prevent polling locations on campuses. And also in Texas, now we see the proposal of a new bill to ban this. But Keesha, you asked about mechanisms that are beyond just student voters. I think this is a really important question. Pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds so that they're ready and informed beforehand so that when they turn 18, they're ready to go. This is a really nice catch-all for people, including those that do not want to go on to a 2-year, 4-year, or technical college. Another mechanism is vote by mail. In 7 states, we actually just filed an amicus brief. I just filed one through the Rutgers International Human Rights Clinic on behalf of the Andrew Goodman Foundation March for Our Lives and the National Vote at Home Institute. And 7 states in the country do not allow young people to vote by mail without free of an excuse. They require people age 60 or 65 up to fit a narrow list, they allow people 60 or 65 up to vote by mail without an excuse. And everyone below that cohort has to offer and meet this narrow list of excuses. And the data shows that expanded BBM access benefits all voters across partisanship, across age cohorts, and especially voters of color, young voters and young voters of color. So I'm with Sarah on this. There's no one single mechanism, and we have to have a really holistic approach to election modernization from the field to the courtroom to Congress and the halls of legislature and the county boards of elections.
Right on. Thank you so much. And thank you. The pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, I don't think is very frequently framed in the context that says most of our active work around young voters is on campuses. What about that gap? And that 16 and 17-year-old pre-registration feels like a solution that I don't think is offered up enough. So thank you so much for that. Good afternoon, Jocelyn. So we want to hear more about your efforts in advancing mobile voting. Why should we consider it? And if you give us just 30 seconds on what mobile voting is.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the question. And thank you to Represent Women for hosting this important event and especially this important conversation. I'm truly honored to be a part of this panel with these amazing women. Sarah, it's always great to see you. But yes, I'm excited to talk to you about the work we're doing in Tusk Philanthropies to expand voting options, to include options like mobile voting, to address many of the barriers that remain in place for far too many voters. First off, mobile voting is a digital form of absentee voting or by mail voting. So it takes everything that you would do on a paper ballot, whether it's filling out the ballot itself or signing and completing an affidavit form that has to accompany your ballot back to the election office, is all done on a digital device, whether it's a mobile device or a computer. It takes the complete process and digitizes it so that ballots are returned digitally to the election office, where they then are printed at that point and tabulated as a paper ballot with all of the other ballots in the election. We really view this as important work in moving elections into the 21st century and pushing the options forward as a way to address barriers that remain for far too many voters. There's some obvious examples. Military voters serving overseas or even domestically face tremendous difficulties getting ballots, and as a result, vote at incredibly low rates. Just 47% of our active duty military voters voted in the 2020 election. That's basically the same rate as 2016, in spite of the overall increase in turnout among all voters between the two elections. Similarly, we see incredible turnout gaps for citizens who are outside of the country. Just 8% of eligible voters residing outside of the United States voted in 2020. You were about 10 times more likely to vote if you were a domestic citizen in 2020 than if you were an overseas citizen that year. And one of the reasons for that is because there are significant barriers to getting and returning a ballot successfully by mail for those voters. And mobile voting options would provide an alternative method for those voters to get and return their ballots without risking the postal delivery delays that they encounter today. Similarly, as Sarah pointed out, voters with disabilities face tremendous challenges voters who are blind or have another type of print disability that prevents them from being able to independently and privately mark a ballot by hand are basically left out of absentee voting or have to give up their basic rights in order to cast a paper ballot by mail, because they have to rely on someone else to mark and return that ballot for them and trust that that person is completing the ballot according to their wishes. And that also introduces challenges for voters who live alone and have to rely on outsiders to come to their home and assist them with voting. And so in states that have expanded options to electronic ballot delivery and return, have seen the benefits of actually enabling those voters with disabilities to vote fully independently and privately. And, you know, we're seeking to expand those options to even increase the security and verifiability of those options so that voters can independently verify that that ballot is cast correctly and that they don't have to give up their rights to a secret ballot while utilizing those options. We also think there's potential benefits in making our election system more resilient as the climate crisis continues. Even though the pandemic is receding, we know that we need expanded options to make elections resilient in the face of emergencies. Just last year, we saw a hurricane strike the state of Florida in the weeks before the election. It was actually the second midterm election in a row in which a major hurricane struck the state and displaced thousands of voters in the weeks before the election. In 2018, when Hurricane Michael struck the Panhandle, the Brennan Center found that it led to a 7% turnout gap among voters in those affected counties from statewide average turnout. So there is a important impact on voters who are fleeing natural disaster and their ability to get and cast a ballot securely, not to mention the impact that it has on election officials who have to scramble and figure out how they're going to get ballots into the hands of those displaced voters. Mobile voting would add a resilient option in those situations that we think would serve voters and election officials. And then, you know, we heard Secretary Way and Secretary Chapman earlier talk about how Gen Z is poised to be the largest voting gap next year, or the largest voting block next year in the 2024 election. And it's really exciting to see the levels of political engagement among Gen Z voters who are already making their voices heard, whether it's through marches or even at the ballot box. Last year, we saw evidence of that in the midterm elections and in the special election in Kansas last August. So it's really exciting to see. But we also know from studies that young voters have continue to have significant turnout gaps from voters who are older, in part because their lives are set up so that existing voting options make voting very difficult. Whether it's registering to vote, which they often are excluded from in some of the ways Yael mentioned, but also getting and returning a ballot is not easy for younger voters who move more frequently and may not have updated their registration, may not actually be all that familiar with mail because that's not where they live anymore. They live on their phones. Anyone who has encountered anyone from that generation will know they are true digital natives. And we believe mobile voting is a way to add options to make voting easier and more convenient and help them overcome some of those barriers and also meet them where they are, because that is where they are. Same thing for other voters who've been historically disadvantaged, whether it's tribal community voters who face probably just incredibly difficult obstacles to voting and to registering to vote, and even voters of color who continue to vote at lower rates than white voters, and that's in part because they're more likely to have to wait in a long line to vote in person, or they're more likely to see an absentee ballot rejected due to a technical deficiency. And so, we think mobile voting options have a way of helping them overcome some of those barriers. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to clarify, I think it was Gen Z plus millennials that was actually going to be the largest Black, not Gen Z alone.
Thank you.
We all love the Gen Zs, but just want to make sure we're keeping all the data in line. There's so many questions and so many ways that stuff is realigned. Really appreciated your point about the environment. 90% of US counties have had some sort of impact from some climate disaster in this country. There's really no avoiding that. We do have to have resiliency, adaptation strategies, particularly within our civic space, to understand that people will not be able to exercise their rights in that kind of way if we don't have something as an alternative to think about. And then Jocelyn, I'm going to put a bug in your ear around questions of ballot integrity. I know they're going to pop up. So why don't I'm going to come back to you because I really want to get to Mayor Searcy. But I'm just going to put a pin in that. Mayor Searcy, how are you today? Love to hear about what systems are being used in Tacoma Park now. And what are you excited about for the future?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to echo my fellow panelists and my appreciation for having the opportunity to speak to you all today and to be in such great company. It's truly an honor. I like to say the city of Tacoma Park is the pilot area for most progressive voting approaches. In the city of Tacoma Park, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote in local elections. We have ranked choice voting, which this last election cycle, we tested to the max, where the majority of our elections included, in some cases, mostly 3, in some cases 4 candidates. So providing residents with multiple options has been really, really important. We also allow undocumented residents in our community to vote in our local elections. So we really do push for equal access and equal voice in how our government is run. And I think that that is something that is extremely, extremely exciting in the city of Tacoma Park. I know that earlier panelists talked about youth voting and ways in which to engage our youth. I have spoken to lots of municipalities in Maryland around how actually allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in local elections actually prepare them more for engagement down the road. You provide those students with this opportunity to learn more about the political process. They get to vote. They have this ability to take some of those lessons learned along with them in ways that are very, very important for establishing the habit of voting, which I think is very important. Another big thing in the city of Tacoma Park is around our undocumented individuals and providing them with the opportunity to vote in our local elections. What it has exposed, which was talked about a little bit earlier, is some of the breakdowns in terms of language access and making sure that your voting materials are translated and you're able to communicate the ability to vote in multiple languages, which is often sometimes lacking in terms of access, which is critically important too when you're talking about vote by mail. So making sure that when you're trying to register people, when you're trying to send out ballots, that they have the ability to access the information in a way in which they can understand. And then ranked choice voting is something that I've been really pushing, and we've been working with our District 20 delegation to make it something that is available to be tabulated at the state level in the state of Maryland, or at least allow our voting machines to be able to tally ranked choice voting ballots. This is something that is, I think, one of the most important tools to not only ensure that residents fully feel that the person that is selected, they had some full say so into who their elected leaders are, but it also forces elected leaders or those who are running for office to reach across the aisle more before they're actually elected. Explaining to people in the community the importance of ranked choice voting or instant runoff is really critical, because it forces candidates to identify those areas of commonality that they share, because you don't necessarily have to just fight for that first vote. You also have to fight for the second one. And so I think that it creates this environment of collegiality amongst candidates. It also encourages residents across the community to learn something about all of their potential candidates that are running for office, so that they can provide an informed decision, not just as in terms of their first choice, but also as it relates to their second. So again, appreciate being here today and look forward to any questions that people may have about what we're doing here in the city of Takoma Park.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mayor. I think one of the things that we appreciated about ranked choice in New York was that because the news had a hard time doing the horse race sort of way of thinking about it, it forced both pollsters and news folks to ask, how do people feel about issues? And in turn, the candidates focusing on the issues. It really changed the shape of the conversation and really made it much more difficult for people to simply attack opposing candidates based on who they are, where they live, where they came from, all of these things, and to really force the conversation into issues in a way that I don't think other mechanisms have been effective in doing. So thank you for that, and really thrilled we had an opportunity to lift this up. We had some questions, and I'm going to allow anyone to sort of jump in, but I do want to return, Jocelyn, to the question of we have that tension of integrity versus convenience and accessibility. We do understand that we all carry around these magic computers in our pockets that we're used to having, but there is no question that integrity and ballot access are incredibly important. So as you think about those tensions, what are the challenges we should be thinking about with mobile voting? Where is the technology now, and what should we be expecting for the near future?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's like, what makes this now instead of a Star Trek voting thing? Like,
right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's incredibly important. I mean, absolutely. The number one thing we need is to make sure that we can expand access without risking the security and integrity of our election, 100%. So, we have supported pilot elections, and actually a majority of states currently, it's up to 32 states plus the District of Columbia do allow at least military voters, and in most cases, military plus overseas voters to return a ballot over the internet. Usually it's by email or fax. And so those current return options are pretty terrible because they rely on an email attachment that then election officials have to open, which is generally not considered a super cyber secure thing to do, to open an attachment from an unknown sender. It also forces voters to rely on technology solutions that, they don't have a way to verify that the ballot that the election official received is the correct ballot. So these are fraud problems. These are not great solutions that we're currently offering voters in federal elections in the United States. But they are important for access. And so that's why election officials balance the risk of those options against the access that it provides to voters who really have no other good option but those kind of not great options. So we've been working on supporting research and development into new technology that will help fix some of those deficient options for voters and give voters new technology that will enable them to independently verify at every step of the process that their ballot is recorded correctly and that it's received by the election office correctly. And so, that this technology is actually, we're funding it with grant money, and we expect it to be available this year. In fact, so it's actually very close to ready, and we're really excited about collecting feedback. We actually ran a mock election with about 50 high school students from across the country last month, and we got great feedback from them. 40% of those students took advantage of the verification options available in the technologies and verified that the ballot was recorded correctly, which is one of the most important tools that this new technology will include for protecting the integrity of that vote and making sure that, even if you're using a device that may not be 100% secure, you have the ability to verify that nothing is affecting how your ballot is being recorded. So you know your vote is safe. And so that's the important element that is currently not available in the options that we're giving voters today who are returning ballots electronically, and that this new technology will hopefully enhance. And we hope this is going to really provide a better option than what we have today, and prove, over time how we can make this option more widely available for more and more voters.
Well, it is exciting and fraught, and certainly a topic that we could spend hours on by itself. But I don't know that we could do much more today with that, but I do think it's really interesting and exciting to think about how this works. There have been some questions and a lot of people who want to know, like, what is the gold standard for voting? I struggle with any sort of one size fits all solution. And I want to start with Mayor Searcy. Like, when we think about gold standards, like, you all are some of the cutting edge in the world, but I don't know that what Tacoma Park do would fit. May become an ill-fitting suit in, say, a Chicago. How do you, as a local official, feel about, like, what do you think about sort of the notion of gold standard, and how do you determine whether something's good as a categorical matter rather than a set of mechanical box checks?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think that part of the problem with the gold standard is assuming that one size fits all. And we just see on the ground that that's just not the case. I think it is more important to make sure that we're doing, as we've heard today, a lot of resources and research around what potential options may exist to meet people where they are. And so how can you, as a person that's trying to provide those tools in the toolbox, how can we customize the individual tools that provides each voter with a buffet of options that they can choose that works best for them? And I think that's the key. What could work for me as a person who, air quotes, is politically or minded or civically minded more so than maybe my neighbor with 5 children, it may not work for her, right? So how do I, as an elected leader, how do I not just think about people like me, but think about people like my neighbor who may need a mobile access to submitting their ballot, or where they're working a job that, although yes, people are supposed to be able to leave their jobs in order to go vote, but the reality is, depending on how and where you work, that may not be feasible. So how can we make sure that we're doing things like having extended hours, vote by mail, vote by email, making sure that materials are translated or able to be translated in the language that you are the most familiar with, so that when you are making a vote, or when you're casting a vote, it's from a place of knowledge, not guessing, because your English is limited. And so I think that those are some of the keys to building the right approach for the right person, I would say, would be the gold standard, and trying to do the necessary research to figure out what those approaches need to be, what those approaches that should be made available are.
Great. I want to turn to Sarah. And I know you did a really expansive introduction around some of the questions with disability, but I wonder if there's a way to kind of shrink that down. How do we think about what we should be thinking about as we think about solutions? I know that oftentimes, at least having been involved in the voting rights community for as long as I have, I frequently don't see disability advocates at voting rights tables in different spaces. We don't necessarily see these communities crossing over in deep ways, which I think forces litigation in funky ways. It does all kinds of things that maybe, how do you think about in terms of like gold standard, not just of like the rules and laws, but those around the advocates and vote, and how do we create the community that we need to actually advocate broadly for what all our citizens need to access the ballot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that it's kind of a two-way street whenever it comes to getting disabled folks in the conversation for voting rights. First thing, it's recognizing they're already in these spaces, especially whenever we're talking about disabled people who are multi-marginalized, and not thinking of, oh, we have disabled people over here and then people struggling for, against racialized voter suppression over here. They're often, the same fight. But making sure that these folks have access to the tables So that means if you're having voting coalitions and opportunities to organize, making sure that those are accessible, that you are providing an opportunity to request accommodations. Right now, that can also mean making sure that there's virtual options, because immunocompromised people are still, not as able to engage in in-person activities. So making sure that there are just opportunities to even be participating in kind of collective organizing around voting rights. And then working with the I don't want to say the growing movement, the disability rights movement has been around for decades, but there has been a lot of movement in the disability voting rights space, whether that is the American Association of People with Disabilities have their Rev Up network, where they have statewide disability voting coalitions working on accessibility, getting involved in those opportunities, finding ways to connect with local disability organizations that are working to address these issues, I think is really important. And then just doing the work to educate yourself on these issues. There are a lot of things that are required by law whenever it comes to disability, but the laws that have been passed haven't been a magic wand. Even though it is required that election officials have websites that are compliant with certain web standards, they're not actually compliant at this point due to lack of resources, lack of education for election officials. Same thing can be said for polling places, where election officials are dealing with a lot of competing priorities, and whenever they're dealing with like site selection for polling places, making sure it's something that works for the community, but that is accessible as well. So working with election officials, working with disability advocates in the community who are trying to have dialogue with election officials, and not having that in some sort of adversarial way, but coming together to work on mutual goals, which is making sure that everyone has the most access that they can to cast the ballot privately, independently, in a way that works for them.
Perfect. It reminds me that what not everyone remembers is nothing about us without us came from the disability space. And that actually was incredibly important to think about, and how almost every improvement to access from the disability community benefits everyone. And that the sort of curb cut kind of accessibility issues that implicate the disability community are very likely to drive up turnout for all populations. Yael, I would love to talk to you a little bit about concrete actions to get reforms enacted, and maybe a little bit about enforcement as well, right? We still see, I know in this last election, New York City still had problems with Section 203, not having ballots in all the correct languages. And so like when we talk about all of these things being good in general, what are the actual mechanics? What are we actually talking about to actually get these things from ideation and conversation actually into play?
Thanks, Keesha. So this is a question really about election administration, kind of from point A to point Z, and what does that look like throughout the process? That's how I'm interpreting the question, Keesha. Is that right?
Well, actually a little bit, but how do we get it from idea to the point where it even becomes a question of election administration? Like when we're saying we have an idea and we want it to be something, how should advocates on this call and in other spaces really be thinking about just, how does this actually occur? How do we actually talk about these expansive measures for ballot access?
I'm glad that I asked. So I really think that this is the power of organizing and the power of convening to bring people together to the table, to have productive conversations, and also to not just to speak, but to put our speaking into action is key. And so that looks like investing in the field, investing in the organizers, investing in the people that are really going to be implementing the action and by taking action. And sometimes there are kind of novel solutions that are introduced, and sometimes there's tried and true, right? Section 203 is something that we all know. It's federal coverage is mandated for single minority language access if you're in a covered jurisdiction of over 5% of the population speaks it. And yet we have really basic questions with regard to access. I actually worked with I have my own law firm, so I end up doing this very kind of dynamic work across the country. And there were Korean speakers that reached out to me from Texas, and they said, we're having trouble with language access. We're not considered a covered jurisdiction, but we're like almost at the 5% threshold, right? And how do we mobilize because we don't meet that threshold? And they started to work together with some strategic support from across the field, but it was really infusing them with the resources and support and the kind of the analytical background, but then they could put it in action, right? And coming back to them when they had, being available for them when they have questions. So I think that we all have a variety of tools in our tool belt. Everyone does. And you could see from the speakers on this panel and today and really across the 3 days that we all have a variety of abilities. And so it's a question about how we work together to implement them. And I look at these, larger solutions. I helped to build a piece of legislation that was introduced in July by Senator Warren and Congresswoman Nikema Williams called the Youth Voting Rights Act. And it offers this kind of comprehensive sweeping approach to protecting the promise of the 26th Amendment, which I talked about earlier. And, we need to be pushing for the federal legislation, which is the dream, is the vision, right? But then how does that translate into state legislation? How does it translate on the local level? The mayor talked about what it looks like for her to be working to do implementing pre-registration, right? Non-citizen voting, all these kind of innovative, and the 16-year-old voting also. So there are a lot of innovations in the field. And it's just, we have so much, even though we have to fight a lot and we face fierce, xenophobic, racist, anti-democracy advocates that are well-funded on the other side, we actually have an embarrassment of riches of resources on our end. And it's about leveraging our human resources and capital. And that's all strategic campaign work. And it's really seeing what we all bring to the table and trying to elevate that.
Thank you, Yael. I think I'm going to pick up on that last point because I think it's incredibly important. I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to allow anyone to jump in. I keep saying that and then calling on people. So I can't promise by the time I'm done with this sentence, I won't do it. But, voting is how we express power in the United States. And we've been talking about a lot of mechanics, but I think Yael alluded to at the end, these real questions about power. What does it mean to be able to show up in these ways? Why do we care about expansiveness? These aren't just questions of mechanical convenience, right? This is literally how we exercise an individual right and demonstrate political power in connection and community with folks voting in the same way. How do we think about, when you think about the driving forces for these, how do these questions about strategic campaigning connected to notions and ideas of power show up for you all in the work that you do? And I know I said I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to go to Mayor Searcy on this one.
I think it's critically important. As an elected official, whether we all want to admit it or not, elected officials typically are beholden to the folks that vote for them. It is this weird dynamic that you're put in as an elected official. And so in order to ensure that you are not only representing the ones that were able to overcome whatever barriers that might exist, or maybe their barrier is a lot lower than someone else's, to get out and vote. The key is making sure that everyone understands the power of their vote, so that you as an elected official is not just beholden to that 40% or that 50% that donated to your campaign or voted for you. It's more, you are beholden to, which you are technically, but the reality is, who's going to show up and to your meetings? Who's going to email you? Who's going to actually donate money to your campaign? And that most elected officials may not want to say it out loud, but it in the back of your head. And so how can you make sure that everyone in your community understands the power that they have with their vote? How are you educating your entire community? How are you bringing those voices to the table? How are you overcoming systematic racism and oppression that forces so many people, minority groups in our community, to feel like their vote does not count. And so that is bigger than, I could give all of the different ways to vote under the sun, but if you as an individual feel that you are completely disenfranchised and your vote and what you want and what you need your elected officials don't matter, that defeats the whole process of democracy, right? So it is really about making sure that everyone in the community, everyone in this country understand the power that they have. And the power of the vote really does set the stage for how elected officials address the issues that are important to you, provide resources to your community, address your needs, but you have to understand that that power that you have is really important. So community education is critical. Again, sharpening those tools and making sure that there's a plethora of ways to vote is important, but also kind of doing that on the ground education of residents across your community, across your state, to help them to understand the power that they do have in their vote, I think is instrumental to changing and transforming voting in America and voter rights in America. If you have everyone flooding their offices, flooding political folks saying, no, I was not able to vote and I'm not leaving until you figure out how to put more polling places in my community, things would change.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I think that's incredibly important. And so I'm going to keep on the question of power, and I'm going to turn to each one of you in turn to kind of talk about power in the shape of the work that you're doing. Sarah, it's impossible in this moment not to think about power in the disability movement, particularly with Judy's passage earlier this week, and how the disability rights movement, to my reading, has been so important to everything else. And I already alluded to why, and for many reasons. But how do these questions about ballot access and power uniquely intersect with the population? 30 seconds.
Yeah, so every issue is a disability issue. Whenever it comes to social justice, healthcare, access to employment, housing. I'm trying to think of the criminal justice reform and the incarceration system. All of these issues are disability issues, and so it becomes really important for people with disabilities and for everyone, because at some point you are going to have a disability, whether or not now whenever you become older, to be able to exercise voting as one of those tools. It is not the be all and end all. There is a lot of activism as shown by the disability community, and Judy Heumann, who you mentioned, is one of the folks who has been an emblem of that for the disability community. It is one of those tools, along with activism, along with working with your elected officials through advocacy, to be able to exercise power over these policy issues that impact our everyday lives and are going to touch every aspect of our lives.
Thank you so much. Jocelyn, I've been able to give you a hard time on access versus integrity, but I'd love for you to pull power into that analysis. How does mobile voting and these questions of power and access come together?
Well, I think, as I said at the beginning, I think there's been a lot of improvements. I think the COVID pandemic exposed the benefit of adding voting options for more voters, but it also revealed that those options aren't working great for everyone. And so I think mobile voting, as the technology is proven, and as it evolves, and as we continue to see advances in the security of using mobile voting tools for voting, I think it has the power to completely transform the idea that different voting groups have better access to voting than other groups, which is basically what we have today, which is a sort of disparate system that works better for some people and not as well for others. And I think it's a way to empower everyone to have, options that work best for them and meet them where they are. And that's what we're hoping to do, through the work that we're supporting.
Right on. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. It's incredibly important. Yael, we're going to ask you to bring us home. Power and youth have gone together since every movement, since the beginning of time. Talk to us a bit about how you conceive of these questions beyond, again, the mechanics of access and polls, but what about that relationship to power, youth, and our future?
Yeah, thank you. And young people have led the way in writing the story of America since the Civil War, since the first Reconstruction, since the Revolutionary War and the second Reconstruction. Young people have always led the way with multi-generational support, but young people have always led the way. For Black youth from North Carolina A&T, HBCU University came together. This was not a random action for them. They had been studying how to manifest the promise of Brown v. Board of Education, and they took targeted action. And unknowing to them, that catalyzed a movement through the South, starting in February 1960, with the support of many others in the field, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, et cetera, and catalyzed through the South a movement that brought the nation together from an interfaith perspective, from an interracial perspective, North and South. We built together through the second Reconstruction. We have experiences of having done that. We have a muscle memory for that. Many scholars are discussing whether or not it's true that we might be in the midst of a third Reconstruction. And Professor C. Van Woodward, who coined the term second Reconstruction and identified it, conceptualized it for us. When you read his writing, he says, you never really know, and when you're in the middle of it, if that's where we are. But what we do see is an incredible amount of physical violence, right? Hopefully we don't have to experience the same type of physical violence that prior reconstructions have had to bring fruit to. Hopefully we can learn from that process as a means of overcoming the political violence that we see in the system. And there are some surefire ways of building this together. I really like the youth piece. We talked about this increasing youth block. Gen Z and millennials are going to make up 44% of the eligible electorate by 2024, 44%. And I like working with young people. I like working with all people, but I specifically like working with young people because they have actually, you know what, I'm going to do the very unexpected thing, the most unexpected thing, which is to quote President Nixon on this, because I do think this is a cross-partisan, beyond partisan issue, the youth vote. And I feel that, you know, they are inheriting the future. They have the right to shape the future. And when he ceremoniously signed the 26th Amendment into the US Constitution, what he said, and it's a short quote, I'm going to read it to you, because your jaw can drop that this came from President Nixon. But, you know, this was a concept that was championed across partisan lines, including by President Eisenhower, Barry Goldwater, right? Nixon said that young people infuse the democratic process with some idealism, some courage, some stamina, some high moral purpose that this nation always needs. Because the country throughout history, we find, goes through ebbs and flows of idealism. And I just love that because they are inheriting the future. And for me, my perspective is they're the canary in the coal mine, that when you look at young people and the ways in which all of these intersecting voting issues, we've all been young once, right? It is a unifying constitutional characteristic. And God willing, we all age. So that's where I find the hope and the optimism on the youth piece. And the voting rights space is in the youth piece specifically.
Thank you so much. And Yael, I know there are millennials everywhere thanking you for still calling them all young. But I want to say thank you so much for your contributions to this conversation, and for really helping us think about what are the mechanics, what are the things that actually have to happen to give life and meaning to the kind of democracy the world has never seen. What we're seeking to accomplish has never been done on this planet. And thinking of access to democracy in terms of equity to build a true multiracial, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and pluralistic democracy where we all have full and fair opportunity to the ballot is the work that you all are entering in many, many different ways. And we so appreciate your contributions. Turning it back over to our team at Represent Women. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keesha, Sarah, Yael, Jocelyn, and Talisha. You all are just amazing, and this discussion was incredible, and you're all doing incredible work. I hope you're all feeling encouraged and inspired by what was shared with us today. Please visit our website, representwomen.org, for more information on everything discussed here, including ways you can get involved with Represent Women. The answers to our trivia questions are also being posted on Twitter, so make sure you head back over there to check that out. And thanks to everyone who participated. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you here tomorrow for International Women's Day, for day 2 of our Democracy Solutions Summit. We'll be focusing on fair elections and upgrading US presidential elections. It was truly, truly an honor to be in this space with such empowering women who are working every day and at every level to strengthen our democracy. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. Bye, everybody.